Hello, everybody. It's Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. Today with me is Nicholas Gvosdev. I met our guest. I met him first time 6 years ago in the United States in a very special place. But because he has been involved in so many institutions and places where he also teaches, so we agreed prior to recording that Nicholas will introduce himself so that everything is properly addressed. Nicholas.
Sure. So very happy to be joining you in my capacity as a senior fellow for Eurasia at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and editor of its journal, Orbis.
Okay. So this is what we have already. So my first question is, Nicholas, so is Eurasia in flames? Is the security architecture and the balance of power already completely destroyed, and something new will have to emerge? And the emergence of it and the process towards emerging of the new more or less stable system will be bloody, chaotic, as it has always been throughout the history of mankind when the systemic wars erupt. What is your take on it?
Well, I agree with you that we are seeing a change. So not to put too big a point on it, but to use the German phrase Zeitenwende, the end of an age, the change of the age. We're in such a period. The world that emerged after 1989 to 1991 in Eurasia, the expectations that we had in the West about certainly a cooperative relationship with Russia, if not full Russian integration into Western institutions, as was very optimistically predicted in the early 1990s, when then Secretary of State Warren Christopher received a memorandum about how Russia could be a member of NATO by 2005, even if it wasn't that optimistic, a sense that Russia was moving in a cooperative direction with the West. This would enable, if a cooperative relationship from, as Clinton and Yeltsin discussed in Vancouver in 1993, that from Vancouver to Vladivostok, moving east across North America, Europe, and then the Eurasian plain, we could end up with some degree of a security community. The European Union's initial proposals for a wider neighborhood with Russia, to have these partnerships, these spaces as they were discussed in the early 2000s, again, predicated on the idea that we could have a cooperative relationship with Moscow, that Russia's goals would align with those of the West for creating a stable security architecture, and also, to be frank, a stable economic architecture. The idea of creating a greater integrated economic space between North America, the European Union, and then the peripheries of Europe into Eurasia. When it became clear, particularly in the second term of the Putin administration by the mid-2000s, that this was not the direction that things were moving in, then the discussion shifted towards, well, could we find some sort of workable modus vivendi between Russia and the West in terms of a Eurasian understanding? The talk about whether this would mean NATO enlargement, pausing, could countries on Russia's border still pursue partnership agreements with the European Union? Could we find some mechanism for coordinating that? 2008, 2014 gave us answers there. What we now have in the wake of Russia's second invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is a move towards rupturing all of these ideas and connectivities. In the 1990s, the sense that both with Russia and with China, that greater trade, greater integration would pull Russia and China into a Western-led liberal order would incentivize them. We're now moving through a period of decoupling. It may not be complete decoupling, but certainly a partial decoupling, partial deglobalization in terms of those links. The economic linkages between Russia and Europe and Russia and the United States are breaking apart, either because of our sanctions or because of the Russian counter-sanctions. And so instead of thinking of integration on whatever terms, we're now seeing the beginnings of a fracturing. And this is a violent fracturing, as you've noted. It's not a peaceful fracturing. It is violent, and it is beginning to determine which parts, when that fracturing begins, obviously countries are going to be worried about when the fracture points, when the shatter points begin to develop, on what side of the fracture they're going to end up on. The fracture, of course, runs directly through the territory of Ukraine right now in the context of a military conflict, but definitely, as we've seen in recent months, concerns in Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan about as Russia sort of cracks away from the West, where does this leave countries on Russia's borders? Can you maneuver, act as a bridge? Can you act as a connectivity, as we've seen to some extent Azerbaijan and Turkey trying to do, of saying, look, we know that this crack is coming, but we're going to try to continue to maintain ties and bridges, or are the cracks going to become unbridgeable? Then that leads to a larger question about the Eurasian space. If we think of it in a larger context, not just simply Russia, not just simply the former Soviet Union, but we think of Eurasia really starting from the Arctic Circle through Central Europe, the Balkans, the northern Middle East, and then all the way on the Great Plains and steppes to China and the Far East. What's going to happen if this, as you said, becomes a zone of contestation? And then that opens up the question of the role of China, the role of India, the role of the United States, as the United States is reevaluating the centrality of Eurasia to its own foreign policy. For pretty much 100 years since the First World War, Eurasia has been key to American geostrategy. Now, increasingly, we are seeing the United States grappling with what it means to pivot to the Indo-Pacific basin, in which case does Eurasia and even Europe become less, not of importance necessarily, but less of a priority, or less of where the United States can play attention. So this Russian fracturing of Eurasia is taking place in the context also of a U.S. pivot away from 100 years where the transatlantic relationship was the priority, where ensuring a balance on the greater Eurasian space was a priority, containing the Soviet Union, and then trying to develop a post-Cold War settlement that would endure in that space. And now, as the United States is torn between going back and continuing with that, or pivoting to the Indo-Pacific. This obviously kind of creates ground for a much further discussion. But one last point before I pause on this, which is important, which is that Russia is again facing its own historical choices about where it will go in terms of seeking partners and allies. And it foreclosed on a relationship with the United States in terms of a partnership. Increasingly, because of what it has done in Ukraine, it has foreclosed the possibility of building with France and Germany, at least as the Russians perceived it, a kind of encouraging a European strategic autonomy that would distance itself from the United States and would be closer to Russia. I think that is now effectively over. And now Russia faces the possibility, and it may be a very unpleasant one, of negotiating its relationship with China in a much more transactional fashion, which may preserve certain Russian equities, but at a much higher cost partnership with China will potentially bring a much higher cost to Russia, but it also raises questions for Europe and the United States of what it means to have Russia and China in a closer embrace, with China as potentially the dominant partner in that partnership for the first time, really, since perhaps one could argue since the days of the Mongols, when Beijing controlled the destiny of the Eurasian space, and what again it means for that question of fracturing in terms of the countries along Russia's southern and western borders. If Russia is pulled or grudgingly moves closer to China, that also potentially sets up a very different global map than the ones we've been thinking about, certainly for the last 30 years.
Yeah, let's permit me to split your brief introduction into a more granular elements, and ask you, of course, the questions about those granular elements. Let's start with, of course, the primary global power, the United States. You mentioned since the First World War, Eurasia's center of attention of the United States geostrategic attention is obvious. Balancing Eurasia, we know both edges of Eurasia, actually 2 world wars and the Cold War, just to make sure that Americans are preventing the regional hegemony. This I understand, but how you think the current United States strategy look in a granular fashion towards Eurasia, given the fact that the world has become more of a connectivity, got closer to each other, as Robert Kaplan rightly stated in his report to the Office of Net Assessment like 3 or 4 years ago about the Marco Polo world, and that the United States has to balance both edges at the same time. And one could argue also the third edge, Persian Gulf, where strategic flows, also culminate. So too many fronts, always too few resources, and the confrontation between the Spikeman's vision of controlling the rimland and the world ocean just to create proper balance of power, or Mackinder's vision of being an active player, for example, in the intermaritime region, so that the continental powers of Europe and Russia, in this case also China, could not start cooperating and create trade patterns that will undermine the Anglosphere. So what is the current? Because this is exactly the dilemma that Ukraine is closed to the American strategy craftsmen. And what is the strategy, and what should be the strategy, in your opinion, to address those things?
Yeah. Well, I think right now what you're seeing in Washington, if I may speak frankly, is a bit of strategic incoherence in that the fact that the Biden administration was prepared to release its national security strategy in the spring, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine forced edits that had to go back in to be redrafted, suggested that the Russian invasion was, if not unexpected, since the Biden administration had been warning about it since the fall, that it was a possibility, but that it had not been considered perhaps as such the game changer as it's now proving to be. And so I think, as you said, even if you have policymakers in Washington who don't recognize the names Spikman and Mackinder, you are seeing really in the different factions, if I may call them factions, or schools or camps within the Biden administration on foreign policy, really arguing out what you've just laid out. Where should be the focus with limited resources and attention? Where should we go? There has been essentially an effort right now, if we can sort of see what has been emerging by default, which is focus a lot now on Ukraine, try to negotiate in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East some sort of workable settlement the president, in going to the Middle East, most people focused on the question of energy, but really part of that visit was to try to shore up and continue this realignment among the Abrahamic Accord countries, and then, of course, to try to re-engage Iran with the nuclear deal as a way of let's kind of tap down the Persian Gulf area, the Middle East, so that we aren't focused there. And then the hope that we can kind of delay or postpone some of what we need to do in the India-Pacific basin by focusing first on Ukraine. So right now we have by default a Ukraine first strategy, which is to focus our attention on stemming and pushing back the Russian invasion, shoring up European alliances, re-pushing back or redeploying back into Europe, with the hope that we can fix this and then pivot back to the Indo-Pacific. Some of the debates that you've seen in Washington and in the United States strategic community are whether or not this is feasible. The idea that as you continue to delay certain elements of your Asia strategy, it becomes harder to build the infrastructure. At what point do you say Europe has had enough? I think one of the things we've seen with the Biden administration. I'll go back and restart that.
Yeah. Sorry for that. Internet.
One of the things that the Biden, no problem. It's easy enough to fix in the editing. So, one of the things that the Biden administration had hoped was that the economic sanctions plus the military assistance that's already been given to Ukraine would have been enough to induce a change in Russian behavior. The problem, the crux of the problem we have now is Russia's resilience perhaps is greater than we expected or we planned for. And so now we're faced with, as you said, a strategic choice. Do you continue to invest time and resources in the question of Ukraine if this begins to detract from other parts of the world? And you've seen some of the Asianists in the United States very concerned about, for example, the drawdown of weapons stockpiles. So this is a shorter term question, but again, this longer term question, which is, and which first of all has implications for Ukraine, which is the end result in Ukraine that the United States is willing to live with, not what we would like to see, which is a different question, but from a strategic point of view, one where essentially we hold the line sufficiently so that Russian ability to project power and force into the rest of Europe is blunted, and then we essentially wait for the impact of decoupling Russia from the West to work on the Russian economy. In essence, perhaps conceding that Ukraine would be a frozen conflict in order to focus on Asia sooner, or as the debate is occurring in Washington, is it no, we have to get Ukraine right now. We have to fix the situation. We have to completely push the Russians back in a way to also demonstrate to China that we would not tolerate a frozen conflict like this if it were to erupt over Taiwan or somewhere else. So that's the shorter term kind of discussion of balancing and attention and how long. But it is important that the initial, in my assessment, the initial mindset in Washington was that by about this time, in August, late summer, we were expecting or predicting a higher degree of Russian exhaustion that would make the Russian ability to sustain the invasion of Ukraine untenable. And the question, and this then brings us back to, well, what type of relationship does Russia have, particularly with China? If China essentially feels that quiet support of Russia in Ukraine, sustaining the Russian position in Ukraine, continues to distract the United States or focus the United States on Europe in a way that is detrimental to the longer term strategic position in Asia. And that, again, is a debate that we're seeing back and forth. But to this larger question that you've raised, and I think what we are settling on and understanding is that linking the Euro-Atlantic basin with the Indo-Pacific basin, thinking about the rimland, thinking about containing China as a potential continental hegemon with a weakened Russia as its partner, is therefore India becomes the geostrategic prize. I think what we're going to see moving forward is the competition to woo India, because India becomes that linchpin. And if India becomes more closely connected through the Quad with Japan and Australia and the United States from the Indo-Pacific side, what it's now doing in the Middle East with the India to the Gulf to Israel, creating that corridor and obviously creating that as an alternative way to move goods and services from the economic dynamos, the Pacific to Europe and to the West. If you see the beginnings of a closer strategic partnership between India and key European states, and then, of course, continuation of the strategic partnership with the United States, then that begins to address this question. On the other hand, Russia and China are trying to incentivize India, not necessarily to join them, but to remain kind of a neutral, to play a bigger role, perhaps on a bigger scale than, say, what we've seen Turkey playing, where Turkey really is on sort of both sides of the fence. And that would be very useful, certainly to Russia, if India were to remain more strategically autonomous. Obviously, we've seen India becoming much more important to Russia as part of Russia's survival strategy from Western sanctions and Western the cessation of Western purchases of Russian energy and of Russian commodities. So I think India returns to its sort of strategic importance that it had, that certainly the British understood in the 18th and 19th centuries, that when you're thinking about these two principal basins of the world where most of the world's economic activity takes place, India sits at the keystone between the two of them. And so how that relationship evolves, not just simply thinking of India as an Asian power, but to the extent we think of India thinking and looking westward, not only towards the Middle East, but towards the Euro-Atlantic world, I think that is really what's going to determine how this security architecture, and as you put it also, the economic architecture takes place for the next 10 to 20 years.
Let's focus now on Russia and its relationship with European Peninsula. Russia, as you said, has to make a decision what it wants to be. But isn't it so that Russia had the time to make the decision, and it decided that it wants to be almost a peer competitor or even a peer power, great power between China, United States, with Europe being a playground of great power game in Eurasia. And this is why they made those demands to the United States for removing troops west of Poland and having a zone of influence. And because it was regarded as a bluff, the bluff was called. And this is what war in Ukraine is all about. So with blood and treasure, the iron cast the iron dice, using the Bismarckian phrase, were cast. And we will see what Russia is. And this is just the beginning of my question. And of course, I would very much welcome your comment, because, I'm sitting in Poland as we speak now. And in Poland, we sort of thought prior to the war that Russia is very well on a way to consolidate its interests with the European continent in terms of, practically speaking, Germany and France after Brexit, and with the United States in decline. Remember Kabul withdrawal, all those lukewarm negotiations of the START treaty, lack of resources, U.S. resources, lack of real forces in Europe. as it was perceived, and the perceived localized dominance of the Russian ground forces in this part of the world. And of course, energy dependence, food supply chains control. So Russians had a lot of leverages. And this is what Putin had in his head when he started this war. Wasn't it so that Russia made the decision of becoming a European power, but with a shareholding much bigger than the West was ready to give to them in the system? And Russia really wanted not to be with China. They wanted to be with Europe, like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky would like to see, but on a completely new terms, where Russia is a great power, maybe even a security guarantor, maybe even the power projection country for the European peninsula, buffer zone against China, projecting power southwards towards India even, if need be, and blocking the Macindarian continental consolidation on as wished by China, even more than the Europeans. So the space from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And you know what? The efforts of the Ukrainian army broke this thing. Not even the United States. Of course, not the German government that still seems in Warsaw to wait out this horrible scenario of cutting off from the Russian energy supply and, find some solution so that those guys still have the cheap energy. So the continental consolidation, including Europeans, was the ultimate goal of Russia, but on new terms, without the United States, and of course with the completely demolition of any agency of the intermaritime countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So do you agree with this assessment and that the war in Ukraine is at least temporarily, for the time being, destroying this dream of Putin and is pushing Russia into the hands of China? And that also poses strategic questions of greater scale to United States, because the United States, as Wes Mitchell rightly pointed in his report to Office on That Assessment last year, doesn't want to have a two-front war. So how would you solve this riddle? And please comment on what I just said.
Well, that's and I think you've started. It's not just simply the treaty proposals that were issued by the Russian government, but even going back to Medvedev proposals for European security in 2009 and 2010. It was clear that the Russian preference was to rewrite the European security order to give Russia not just simply a greater voice, but to get more control over what happened in European security events, and by extension to European politics and economics. That Russia did not want to enter into, and we've seen this with the beginning, the Russian NATO efforts stymied on the fact that Russia was not willing to accept a role that would require it to make a series of not concessions, but accommodations to the way things are done. That there is a rule set that exists in European security, in Euro-Atlantic security, and of course we're seeing some of the other partners in Europe also perhaps pushing back against some of these notions now as well. But that's a separate, perhaps a separate discussion. But the Russians were always looking for, and then by that, how could they gain influence, and particularly using energy, economics, geoeconomic tools to win support towards their vision of a restructured Europe, restructuring the post-Cold War settlement. It was always very clear that the focal point of that strategy was, if you could create some sort of effective partnership with Paris and Berlin to counterweight and move around Central Europe, certainly. Getting the British out of the European Union was, at least at the beginning, a strategic boon to Moscow's efforts there. And then you could essentially, what we've always seen, and I think this was clear for 20 years, that in the end, Russia always wanted Berlin and Paris to essentially tell other, and to some extent now Rome, tell other European capitals, this is the new way things are going to be done, and you will accommodate Russia in these areas, and that's that.
Exactly.
And certainly what is very interesting about the timing and this raises questions about the timing and the clock and the planning in the Kremlin, is launching the invasion of Ukraine this year before Nord Stream 2 was operational, before some of the greater interdependence that Nord Stream 2 would have created, not just simply for gas, but for petrochemicals, and then ultimately for hydrogen, right? Yeah. Because you may recall that some of the discussion about Nord Stream was not just simply about gas, but then that, creating the foundation so that as Europe, in theory, pivoted away from hydrocarbons over the next 20 to 30 years, the next stage was developing Russian hydrogen in the same areas of the north, and then being able to say, well, now we have this pipeline infrastructure. It can be used for natural gas. Now it can be converted to hydrogen, or we can convert one of the Nord Stream lines to hydrogen when hydrogen comes online. And really, if in a way, if Russia had simply waited another 2 years, and why Russia didn't, is it because they bought their own worries about Ukraine? Ukraine would be too successful. Who knows? But the interesting point is that they launched this invasion at a point before, if it occurred later and these things had already been in place, it would have been much more difficult, I think, to, you might not even have the invasion. You might have had a different type of Franco-German mission to Moscow to avert military conflict, which would have been much more accommodating. But the fact that Russia decided to do this now, before all of this was finalized, suggests that something about their strategic calculus shifted. But as you said, this now puts the Russian strategic establishment in a very unpleasant position, because in the end, I think Russia has always preferred negotiating with Berlin and Paris to negotiating with Beijing for a variety of reasons. But the biggest one, of course, is that China's style, and we've seen this throughout the Belt and Road area, we've seen this even in Eastern Europe, and other countries, that China is not an altruistic investor, and that they are they will take their pound of flesh. And now it will be potentially Russia's turn. For years, having kind of held the Chinese off in a number of areas where Russia was unwilling to concede, China may finally gain access to the Arctic in a way that Russia was not prepared to do so. And then, of course, this has, as you said, changes some of the geostrategic considerations of Europe and the United States, because of China, which is able to dominate in this partnership with Russia, gains access to raw materials and supply lines that are harder for the United States and in the case of and Europe and Japan in the case of a conflict to interdict, but also just simply gives that raw material treasury to a Chinese economy and military industrial base that changes China's ability over time to project power. And again, at the expense of Russia's ability to be an independent player in the international system. I mean, this is really, I think, what we might be writing about in coming years, is by launching this invasion of Ukraine in this style, in this fashion, in this timetable, the end result has been maybe that Russia ceases to be, certainly to be a player in Europe. It is pulled into a Chinese orbit, which does not ultimately, in the direction, even for Putin himself, authoritarian modernizer though he may be, the model in the end was always Europe. And now the model will be Beijing, and we know how what the impacts that will be on Russian state and society, to be largely pulled into a Chinese-dominated system. I think it will amplify these fracture points, but it'll also potentially amplify fracture points within Russian society itself. Russians' conception, even if Russians conceived of themselves as Eurasian, as being sort of Europe, but somewhat separate or affiliated with Europe, a profound reorientation of Russia away from 300 years of looking westward, of thinking of Europe as its place to be a power towards, being the Western outpost of a Sinosphere rather than the Eastern marchlands of Europe, I think will have profound consequences.
I think that will change the history of the last 500 years of European Peninsula. So this is the major transformation of the security architecture in Northern Eurasia. If that would be the outpost of the Chinese influence, that would tell something as well. So,
well, and and in a way, it provides, for 30 years, we have, how many conferences have we all been at with people scratching their heads, asking what is the future of the North Atlantic Alliance? What's the future of NATO? NATO re-envision this in essence, and I think we see this in the strategic concept and understanding that NATO is returning as a strategic security alliance, and that part of this is to ensure that the European peninsula and as much of those European borderlands are protected. And then again, if we begin to think about NATO and the strategic concept begins to think through the Mediterranean, through the Rimland, connecting with emerging security architecture in Asia, this doesn't necessarily create a global NATO, which I don't think is necessarily feasible, but a series of strategic partnerships and coalitions, which then can create the basis for a new balance of power. And I think that in some ways, we have a revised version of Kennan. Just as George Kennan said, you contain the Soviet Union until you allow for a certain process of transformation within to occur, that at a certain point, a China that is balanced and contained has internal issues, which, as we've seen, communist systems can adapt, but they're also brittle, as the Soviet Union proved. And that, this, again, kind of a containment for the 21st century of avoiding war, making sure that conditions for war are never feasible, but at the same time, preventing from kind of using external export of problems in order to sustain or maintain control of the system at home. And perhaps this will lay the basis, not China joining the World Trade Organization, which I think was the hope at the beginning of the millennium, to transform China, but a China that cannot, in essence, push outward to solve its domestic internal problems, then that creates the basis for internal shifts. So that may be, as you said, not only rewriting the history of Europe for 500 years, but maybe that we also have to go back and rethink some of the lessons of the 20th century for the 21st.
Let's focus for a while on China. You mentioned Kennan and the containment strategy of the United States, but don't you think that the containment strategy against China is undoable in contemporary world for the following reasons? First of all, Kennan's grand strategy for the United States was proposed at the end of the Second World War, when there were red lines, because where the Soviet troops were, this was the Soviet sphere of influence, when the American and so on and so forth. So there was no gray zone, or at least no unknown zone, who belongs to whom. There was no globalized trading system. So there was no tension. It's like with marriages. Once you divorce, it's the most, tension provoking. When you are separate, it's not. And here the story is that in order to contain China, first you would have to decouple, because China is everywhere. everywhere in our homes, in our houses, in our families, because they are the greatest manufacturer of common goods from the entire, human civilization. So how can you contain such a country that has so many connectivities with so many countries, either raw supplies from Middle East and Australia or backwards and so forth, so forth? That's a good example of Germany. They didn't want to bandwagon with the United States strategy against China. They don't want to ally with the United States on that. Even the allies in Asia being threatened by China are afraid that they might be on losing end, because at the end of the day, China has always been in history, with an exception of the last 150 years, the largest economy of the world. So we are betting on a winner. Okay. So how do we want to adopt canon? And I think this is the most important question in our conversation, especially long term for the entire 21st century. Because if the United States adopts a wrong strategy,
yes,
we're going to have a war, systemic war over dominance on planet Earth. So what should be the best strategy of the United States to deal with a rising China?
Well, as you said, China is everywhere. But I think what we've seen from the pandemic onward is the realization that China being everywhere with no alternative is not necessarily a long-term sustainable approach. That complete decoupling is going to be difficult and will not happen. So we'll set that aside. But alternatives and encouraging those alternatives becomes quite critical, both so that there are alternatives in place, but also to reduce some of that over-dependence on China. So largely, this is not going to be a military strategy. This is going to be an economic one. The question then becomes, is there going to be sufficient will and interest and a willingness, not just simply of governments, but let's bring it down to the average person. Let's bring it to the doorstep level, to consumers in countries willing to pay a price, increased price, in order to decouple or partially decouple from China. So the question then becomes of a number of these initiatives that have started over the last number of years: resilient supply chain, the golden supply chain initiatives in the Asia Pacific, which is to ensure that we have alternatives to a supply chain that always runs through China. Do we support and encourage India's efforts to become an alternative supplier of semiconductors so that we're no longer caught in the Taiwan-China trap of semiconductors, that we have alternative sources? Do we move ahead? A very interesting set of proposals coming out of the Atlantic Council, Ash Jain, Matthew Kronig, and Marlene Petzinger from collaborating with them from IISS, about do we begin to consciously, in a policy sense, reorient our trade and supply chains towards a greater, what they call a democratic trade and economic partnership, where we take our supply chains, we take our raw material bases, and we ensure that we have created alternatives so that not all trade runs through China. Because as you've noted, the Chinese strategy is to make China the indispensable country economically.
Yeah.
And so the question is that China will always be a major economy and major trading partner. But for the last 20 years, we operated from a very benign business sense that interdependence meant that you could not have security challenges, you could not have conflict. This was the Dell theory of conflict prevention that Michael Dell coined, that if you have an integrated supply chain and China is part of that supply chain, that China will never threaten the use of force because it's part of an integrated supply chain and we're all making money from it. What the Japanese government has been doing over the last several years is a beginning of a benchmark of conscious, and again, this for the United States creates some issues where we traditionally don't like or we're allergic to government playing a role in economy, but what the Japanese have been doing, first starting under the late Prime Minister Abe and continuing, which is to give support for diversifying these supply chains. Precisely for that point that you raised, that yes, allies in the Asia Pacific, even those threatened by China, may not be willing to engage in collective action for fear of interrupting their economic links, or because they need vital raw materials, or they need commodities, or they need particular component parts that China produces. So a 21st century Kennan is not primarily as you said, where the troops are, and we had a sense of the red lines and the blue lines, and we could draw that on the map. But it is thinking in these geoeconomic terms, and thinking very consciously about where we're choosing to supply from. And again, where it comes back to consumers, and this is where it may falter. Let me be very, very blunt and say where this could fail. This could fail because consumers in various countries may say, I want the cheapest option. Europe, Germany will go through this test. Everyone in Europe will go through this test with energy, of saying, well, I don't care what Russia has done in Ukraine. I want lower energy bills. And if that means sacrificing European security on the eastern frontier, so be it. And again, in democratic countries, we face the possibility that voters may not be convinced. But I think that if we begin to build these networks, these economic networks, as you build these economic networks, you build the security networks to safeguard them, and then a balance does begin to emerge. It doesn't have to be confrontational. It can't, but it will emerge because you will have these alternatives. China will also then have to assess whether or not what it has done, and we saw this during the pandemic. The pandemic revealed the ability and willingness of China to weaponize and use their economic linkages as pressure. You want vaccines, you want protective equipment, you want pharmaceuticals. It wasn't just simply a business relationship anymore of pay us money on the barrel and we'll deliver. It was, no, not just simply you'll pay us for these things, but here's a list of political demands we have. That should be a wake-up call. That this idea that trade happens no matter what, business is business, that is not necessarily the view held in China, certainly not by the Chinese government. And therefore, we do have the beginnings of this strategy beginning to emerge for a partnership among democracies to reorient their trade. And then, frankly, also, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated, that partnership becomes also vital in the question of energy, not only with filling the short-term issue of hydrocarbons, but about having to move to new technologies in the long run. My worry here is that a lot of great proposals, so we have the DTEP proposal, we have the European Union-US trade and technology dialogue. We have the Quad in Asia, talking not just simply about security, but talking about resilient supply chains. But it will take committed governments that will sign on to these strategies. It will take investments, and it's going to take staying power. If not, then the risks that we run two sets of risks. One is we simply sort of revert back to what we had, not quite prior to 2020, but we just learned to live with Russia, China, and some of these economic dependencies return, and we kind of muddle through that way. Or the other worry that you have said, which is the economics don't come together, and so we have the instrumentality of the sword, and then all of a sudden we begin thinking about this containment in military terms, which could potentially lead to, as you said, a systemic war, which, because we're dealing with nuclear armed powers, raises not just simply a destructive conventional conflict, but once again puts us under the sword of Damocles that we thought we'd escaped from when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991.
So I'm gonna have the last question about Europe par excellence. So what's going to happen to Europe then? What's going to happen to EU? Will it disintegrate over the issue as to the assessment of threat? And I think this is the most primeval factor in trying to consolidate any political unity. Yes, and it seems to us here in Central and Eastern Europe that there is no common threat perception across the EU. Whether it will be pressed hard by energy crisis and the social contract breakdown if the energy crisis gets more profound, and food supply as well crises and pressure from the Middle East and Levant and Northern Africa. So is Europe going to be a playground of great powers without military, without the industry of the future, with shrinking demography? What do you think? Well, how would you forecast the future of Europe?
Well, Europe has choices to make, and it has choices to make in the coming months and years, which will determine what arrangements exist on the continent, and then, as you said, not just simply on the continent, but how it connects to the regions around it, particularly across the Mediterranean to Africa, across the Atlantic to the United States, into the Middle East, and of course into not just simply Russia, but the rest of Eastern Europe and Eurasia, that from the Caspian and the Black Sea. I think that the first thing is that this realization that somehow we had entered into a post-conflict world in Europe where hard decisions about military things would be taken by others outside of the continent has to end. I think we're already beginning to see that. We were seeing that beginning in fits and starts after 2014. But the realization of that Europe has to be able to defend itself. It has to be able to do more for its own security. This also means, as you said, a revisitation of solidarity. It's amazing as an American to watch Europeans talk about Europe as an entity, and then when decisions or hard choices are made, everyone fragments back to their sovereign national unit. This is the conversation of what it means for European solidarity between Poland to Portugal, Norway to Greece, is what extent your problems are my problems. If someone in Portugal says, well, I'm not worried about Russians coming anywhere here other than as tourists, maybe, Russian money coming in a corrupt fashion, but I'm not worried about Russian troops. Well, maybe you should, because that is part of their. Someone in Norway says, I'm not worried as much about the migration question. Well, then perhaps that's of concern. I think rebuilding, I think it's easy to have solidarity when times are good, times are bad, and the question of solidarity is more critical. That may sound very glib coming from an American sitting across the water who is not dealing with the real crisis that this creates, but that building that sense and honing that sense of solidarity in a time of crisis is going to be critical, and drawing on that. Talking about demography, Europe, I think, has to start making some decisions about, as a European Union, about human capital. Where do you want human successor capital to come from? How much is internally generated by fertility? How much should be encouraged by immigration? This brings us back to the question of Ukraine, in a sense that, and other former republics of the Soviet Union, in terms of, does Europe see that? Obviously, that's a real problem for Ukraine if Ukraine were to depopulate and continue to depopulate. But does Europe want migrants coming in, immigrants coming in from cultures that are similar? This also raises the question of Latin America and Western countries, Western cultures. Do you want immigrants that can be assimilated culturally, even if physically they may look different? Don't necessarily. And these are longer term societal questions, but I think that this links into this question of where ultimately I think that, and the choice is being made perhaps grudgingly, but yes, we need to be thinking Europe as a key component, as a united Europe, as part of this extended Atlantic community. When we start thinking about the Atlantic community, not just as the United States, but we're thinking about Latin America, we're thinking about Western Africa as part of that community, not just simply for resources and trade, but you're dealing with a region of the world that has some commonalities and that you can build on those for connecting. Europe used to be connected. One just simply has to travel in Latin America to understand the cultural connections between Europe and the Western Hemisphere. But encouraging that sense of community, and there's been some move perhaps with the EU and Latin America, but I think that you begin to think of the Atlantic community really, and Europe having to play a bigger role in its defense, a bigger role as the industrial powerhouse, as one of the technological powerhouses of an expanded Atlantic community. And when you think of an expanded Atlantic community around the Atlantic basin, that really becomes a key part of any kind of global balance moving into the 21st century. And then thinking about how far that Atlantic community extends. And this again, where the question of, I think, we started our conversation with this, Ukraine, and not to be trite about the root meaning of the term Ukraine, but it is Ukraine, it is at the border, and really, I think this sense of where Europe really begins to say this is where we're going to kind of draw our, if necessary, fortifications, but also the idea of safeguarding this as an economic community, as a technological community, an energy community, a health community, of thinking of the Atlantic Basin and the Atlantic Alliance in those terms. It does require leaders. It requires parties prepared to make the arguments to populations why I hope that we'll see a new generation of leaders in Europe and the United States, an Atlantic community of 21st century. So I remain hopeful in that regard. And I think that that's also really one of the best ways to ensure that we don't end up with the war as an alternative hanging over our heads as we move into the midpoint of this century.
Let this be a summary, or at least the final point of our conversation that has started in the earnest towards the end of our recording. So that's maybe a hope for convincing you for another one shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nicholas Gvosdev was our guest at Strategy and Future. Thank you, Nicholas. And please stay with us for more episodes to come. Thank you very much. Jacek Bartosiak.